welcome to part 2 of Chad Daybell, who is he, the murderer. Today's chocolate, Ritter Sport Marzipan. So, welcome to True Crime, Faith, and Chocolate. I'm your host, Dateline, USA Today bestselling author of Just One More and a whole lot of other stuff. So, today's chocolate is Ritter Sport Marzipan. One of my favorites. I got this pack from my best friend, Louisa. So, Chad and Tammy's family, they now have 5 children. Eventually, I'm not sure exactly time-wise, but they have 5 children eventually, and they're back in Springville. Well, at one point, Chad decides to apply to graduate school, and as he's applying, his voice tells him that his mission is not through academics. He has another mission to perform. That is echoes of Tim Ballard when he was at BYU, and the professor said, "Dude, you're not cut up for academics," and Tim Ballard's like, "Oh, yes, because my mission is elsewhere." Not that you're just not so smart. I wonder, because Chad says he threw away his application in the garbage as soon as the voice spoke. I wonder if he actually applied and wasn't accepted. I have no proof. I have no evidence of that. But going back to Dr. John Matthias from Hidden True Crime again, he points out that Chad is very low on the characteristic of openness. There are 5 characteristics that psychologists agree that they're as measurable from a research standpoint, and openness to new experiences is one of them, and Chad is very low on that. And many people, essentially a third of that rating you get is based on your IQ. And so I love how Lauren piped in and goes, basically Chad's not that smart. Dr. Matthias was a little, John's a little, he tried to hedge a little bit and kind of say kinder, but essentially, yeah, Chad's not that smart. So, anyway. Essentially, though, so he throws away, supposedly, his graduate school application, has other things to do. He worked at Cedar Fort Books, also called Bonneville Books, and it was sort of the third biggest publisher in the Latter-day Saint book industry at the time. And at some point, Tammy worked there too, because Tammy was working there when she rejected one of my friends. But within the LDS culture, it is expected the husband is the breadwinner. If the mother and the wife wants to work, party on, but it's his responsibility to make sure that the family is taken care of. That never happened in their marriage. So to me, that's a red flag right there. That this is what's going on, Chad. You're not doing your basic responsibility of taking care of your family. Tammy always had to work. And then even at the end of her life, she was the one that had the full-time job with benefits. She's the one who had the life insurance policy that he made her up right before she died, conveniently. He's off just doing his thing, writing his books, and not selling much. Eventually, he sets up his own book publishing company called Spring Creek Books. It wasn't that great, in fact. Here's a confession here. I often teach at writing conferences, and when I teach a class on writing good dialogue, I have examples of very bad dialogue. And some of my examples come from one of the books that he published. So it's a Spring Creek book, and I've never said that publicly before. The author has since passed away, so I don't feel bad. I'm not going to say the author's name, but it was a Spring Creek book. So this is one of Chad's books. It was bad. It was so bad. He's not a good writer, and he's not a good editor. He can't recognize talent. But there's one book he decided, I'm sure after Betty's experience and watching her bestsellerdom, he decided, oh, you know what? Near-death experiences, NDEs, let's do that. So he finds Suzanne Freeman, who is a Latter-day Saint, and she actually had a friend of mine, ghostwrite her experience, and then Chad published it. And he's like, oh, okay, this is actually doing pretty well. Eventually, though, some of his beliefs and teaching started getting a little out of line, and Suzanne she's very, very, I would say Orthodox Latter-day Saint, and I remember actually again being in a forum where she was like, I was very uncomfortable with the direction his beliefs were going, and I needed to cut off my business relationship with him. He wanted more books from her, and I think that he did at least 2. But she was like, I want my rights back, and he didn't want to give them back. He wanted to charge her all this money for it and all these things, because his business was not doing well. Spring Creek at one point was making $2,000 a year. That's not good. So no wonder he wanted Suzanne to buy her rights back. But interestingly, after Tammy's death and all of this stuff started coming out, that maybe he's involved, Suzanne pulled out her last email to Chad. She'd forgotten she wrote this, but she shared it with the group, and she said this publicly since, so I'm not. In fact, Hidden True Crime interviewed her, and there's a whole episode with Suzanne you can watch, and she mentions this there. But her email says, and I'm not remember the exact terminology, I don't think, but she said essentially, where you're going, those teachings are going to lead to, I believe she said, misery and death or something like that. She mentioned death in particular. She'd forgotten she wrote that, but in her mind it was just sort of like I don't think she thought murder, but she just thought, like sadness and bad things. This is not good, Chad. But looking back, it was like, oh, that's a haunting thing that I didn't realize I had actually said, and that's somewhat prophetic. Ironically, somebody else is being prophetic about Chad, and he's not really a prophet. Okay, so Spring Creek is not doing well. He goes back to the cemetery again. Tammy again is constantly working. So now with Suzanne not publishing with him, Chad needs to find a new NDE author, and now he finds that in Julie Rowe. And Julie Rowe's book does very well. It has a lot of things in it that people like to latch onto. That's, the kind of thing that inspires a lot of fear. And frankly, that's something that really bothers me. A lot of these people who get these big platforms it's based on fear. And I want to go, guys, look at the scriptures. Who is the author of fear? Not Jesus. That would be Satan. Like, fear is not a place we're supposed to be operating from. But that's Julie's book. It's very much about only those who have been gathering their 1-year supply of food, which is something that used to be counseled for us to do. You won't find that anymore. It's usually just, in fact, President Hinckley, a couple of presidents ago, president of the church, specifically came out. I want to say, I have to look at the date, but it was in the, I believe, early 2000s when he actually said, guys, do not go overboard with this. Do not go into debt to get your food storage. Do not. Basically, he was calling out the diehard preppers, saying, don't do that. That's unwise. It's unnecessary. Like, having some extra food and money and that kind of thing on hand, that is just smart. He never said anything against, like, 72-hour kits or whatever. And the church now has, like, they promote classes like financial security and things like that. It's not about making sure everybody has a year's supply. But Julie Rowe's book was essentially saying this concept that has really taken off, that the time is near where there'll be a test, where it'll be like, it's time for everybody to move into these new city compounds that we're building, and your ticket in is if you have a year's supply of food. You can show with your supply of food and put it on a truck, and then you're allowed to enter into this new compound that we will build, ostensibly in Idaho. But that is something a lot of these people believe. And so anyway, her book went big, and as it got bigger, it was being sold in Deseret Book and Siegel, which are LDS-based bookstores. But as the church leaders started realizing what she's talking about, they're like, ooh, we don't endorse this. This is not good. And you start seeing things from CES teachers. So that's Church Educational System, which includes the high school, like church classes that the kids do. You're at early morning seminary and that kind of thing. So it's seminaries, like it's for like 4 years of like basically high school, and then institute would be like the college level classes. Those teachers like to jump on things that are popular. And oftentimes, usually have great teachers who stick to scripture and things like that. But if there's something like a popular book that comes up, often you'll get things that aren't doctrinal, aren't based in beliefs, and then those things get a life of their own and start spreading. So the church actually sent a letter to all church educational system employees and teachers and said, do not use Julie Rowe's book or anything she's talked about. We do not endorse this. This is not in line with the teachings of the church. The book was then taken away from those bookstores, and now Chad was left without his golden goose again. The interesting thing also to note with Julie Rowe is that she has been diagnosed with schizophrenia. Now, this is nothing against mental illness. I have depression, and I actually have a dear friend who has schizophrenia, and he himself, though, member of my faith as well, at the height of his illness, he knew between delusions and hallucinations and whatever else, that he could not necessarily trust his version of reality or presumed perception. So when it came to spiritual things, he's like, hey, to his wife, it's like, this is your responsibility right now, because we can't trust, his radar is off right now. And Julie, I don't think, has grasped that. She claims she no longer has a mental illness. You don't just get over schizophrenia. And if she's not medicated and whatnot, she's probably seeing things. I believe she is seeing things, but that doesn't mean it's real. And yet people are following her. So that's a concern. Other things Julie Rowe has done, she was excommunicated. She's continued to grow her community and her followers with all of this fringy stuff. She is one of the people, one of the first, I believe, to be going into all this whole past lives nonsense that Chad eventually got wrapped up in. Where, oh, you were with this person in a past life. You were Napoleon, or you were Joan of Arc, or whoever, and you two are married. You're not in this life, but you were in that life. And that's broken up current marriages and whatnot. People have had affairs. There's been some accusations of people saying that Julie and Chad had an affair. Don't know. To me, it's entirely possible. I have no idea. I'll likely do some videos on Julie at some point, but yeah, she is kind of a disturbing person. When Chad was first arrested, she came out so strongly in support of him, even saying things to the point of, my guardians showed me that he's innocent, just you wait. And of course, and now that all this other stuff has come out, she's like, oh, never mind, I was wrong. But yeah, she has guardians and she can see the other side and blah, 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 blah. Whatever. But yeah, look up Julie Rowe if you're interested. Hidden True Crime and others have covered a lot of her stuff. I would caution against necessarily looking her up and following her directly, but yeah. So Chad and Julie were both actually part of AVOW, AVOW, which stood for Another Voice of Warning, which was an online group, mostly a prepper apocalyptic kind of a thing, but aimed at members of the LDS faith, but with a diehard prepper point of view. And they had memberships that you would buy, and then you would have access to various content, and Chad would write there for the paid content area. And in one of his posts, he talked about his train dream, where he was boarding a coal train, and he sees all these other authors like him telling the truth, and then he sees all of the church's first presidency and 12 apostles, so our 15 top leaders, also board the train, and he realizes in that dream that the leaders are fallen and they don't know what's really going on, but the authors on the train do. So here's just a pause. I'm one of those people who do not think that our leaders are completely infallible, and one reason I believe that is because the first presidency and the 12 have to have a unanimous view before major changes happen. And they sometimes have had to walk things back because they're human, and they're, Chad actually talks about receiving things like a download. And he's since passed away, but one of my favorite apostles, Elder Scott, would talk about the way you get revelation. It's not a download. That he would receive this impression, and the way he would do it is he would write down the impression, and then he would pray and say, did I get it right? Any corrections? And then if he would feel that he'd gotten something incorrect, he would make corrections, and then he would say, is that correct? And is there anything more? And he would repeat this until he felt like he had gotten the full information correctly. And that is completely not how Chad functioned. I got a download. Here's everything. So, and also, who am I going to trust? One dude who claims that he knows everything and can see everything, or 15 men who have to come to an agreement. So, just saying. You can't trust Ted. Okay. Also, one big thing we believe in as a church is that the gospel and all of the ordinances and all of the fullness of the gospel has been restored it's been brought to earth in various time periods. It's been lost and then returned. And that this time is the last dispensation. This is the last time that has been brought back. It will not be taken away again. So if Chad and these other people believe anything, and they purport to have LDS beliefs, then you cannot then say, our leaders are completely fallen and now I'm the prophet, because that would mean there's a break and there's a new dispensation of some kind. That doesn't jive even remotely with the bottom core beliefs. So explain that one. Anyway, okay. So as part of AVOW and whatnot, Chad starts speaking at conferences, often at ones called Preparing a People. I will note that Tim Ballard also spoke at many of these same conferences. Connection? Perhaps. Okay, so that's where Chad starts spreading his stories about his near-death experiences and his visions of the end of time, including his white tent beliefs. That's, the show up with your food storage, and that's your ticket in to these white tent communities. And he believes that the end of time is coming very, very quickly, which I personally believe it is far, far away, but we are not looking at the end of times anytime soon. But yes, so he also says that his books that were fiction, supposedly about the end of times, he goes, actually, I had to just call them fiction. So bookstores would carry them, but they're not fiction, they're real. They're prophecies, things that I've seen that's going to happen. So that's a little disturbing. So he says he's been told to move to Rexburg. Part of this is, I believe, because Idaho is supposedly where these new, settlements are going to be happening. That's where people will be safe and all that. I also think there's another reason. And maybe this is giving Chad too much credit for being too smart. Entirely possible. But in Idaho, if there's an unattended death, you are not required to get an autopsy. It's up to the family. Meaning, if he had stayed in Utah and then killed Tammy in Utah, he would have been required to have an autopsy for Tammy. And then very quickly, we would have known that she was murdered. Whereas in Rexburg, it was like, oh, she felt sick and then she didn't wake up. And then they're like, oh, okay, I guess that's just natural causes. Weird. Maybe she had an aneurysm or something. We don't know. Heart attack? Blood clot in the lungs? I don't know. But, but he lied saying that she was sick the night before. And then she just conveniently just dies. And he goes, oh, we don't need an autopsy. That's fine. That would be too traumatic. And he buries her so quickly, too. That was, and back in Springville, it was so fast that a lot of family couldn't even get from, Idaho to Springville. And the whole situation was bizarre. Okay, so this is where we start to collide with Lori. I'm going to break it there for part 2. So stay tuned for part 3 of Who is Chad Daybell? Monster Murderer.